Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Julia Mackiewicz from the Polish Institute. And together with Moreshet, Anielevich, and Jewish Historical Institute, we would like to invite you to a series of webinars that will continue the next few months. Tonight's webinar is very special, and the host, Noam Leibman, will ask questions, Dr. Katarzyna person.
Okay, thank you, Yulia. Just a second, we'll just make sure that we have no problem. Okay, so my name is Noam, and I'm from Moreshet, Mordechai Anielevich, Memorial Research and Education Center. This evening, we are hosting Dr. Katarzyna person. We'll have 45 minutes of discussion and then approximately 15 minutes for questions. When we'll get to the questions session, please submit your questions via the Q&A button on your screen and not with the chat. Dr. Katarzyna person is a historian of the Holocaust and its aftermath, working with the Emanuel Ringelblum Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. She is currently a 2020 till 2022 Marie Curie Fellow at the Ludwig Maximilians Universität Munich. She received her doctorate from the University of London and her habilitation in 2020 from the Polish Academy of Science. She has held fellowships, among others, in Yad Vashem, the Center for Jewish History in New York, and the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, Humboldt Research Fellowship. She has written a number of articles and 3 books on the history of Jews in Poland during the Holocaust and the immediate post-war period. An English translation of her book entitled Warsaw Ghetto Police, the Jewish Order Service during the Nazi occupation will be published in early 2021 by Cornell University Press in association with United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. In the Jewish Historical Institute, Dr. Person heads the full edition of the Ringelblum Archive Publishing Project. She is the editor and co-editor of the 5 volumes of documents from the underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. So, good evening, Katarzyna. Before entering today's subject, I'll be happy if you could start with a few words about the Emanuel Ringelblum Jewish Historical Institute.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be starting this cooperation and this project. My institution, the Jewish Historical Institute, Emanuel Ringelblum Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, is an institute which was set up in 1947, so now I'm counting, 73 years ago, as a continuation of the Central Jewish Historical Commission. So the first body which was aimed at collecting testimonies from Holocaust survivors, and also the first body really to conduct academic research on the Holocaust, publish sources on the Holocaust. And so we do to this day. But of course, the Institute is much more than just a research institute. There is also extremely strong educational work which we carry out, which is aimed at everyone from school groups to university teachers, postgraduate students. There's also a very important part of our work is teacher training. So training for teachers who then teach at schools on the Jewish history and history of Polish Jews. There's also a publishing department which works extensively and publishes books on the Holocaust. And of course, not just the Holocaust, history of Jews in Poland in general. We also have a lot of outreach of exhibitions, and our permanent exhibition is dealing with Ringelblum Archive, the underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. It's fully accessible in English if you're interested. And we also have other activities. For example, in a few days, we'll be opening a temporary exhibition on the 80th anniversary of the closure of the Warsaw Ghetto. There's also a series of events, talks and seminars associated with this exhibition, and all the information is on our website, of course. So you're all very welcome to join us and join our events.
Thanks a lot. Your book, Policjanci, meaning policemen, was published not long ago in 2018. And at this time, there were already 2 studies that dealt with the Jewish police in Warsaw. The first was written by Aaron Weiss almost 50 years ago, and the second was written by Aldona Podolska and was published in the mid-90s. So why did you choose to write about the same subject? What was missing, or what you thought that should be discovered?
Thank you. This is a really good question, and a very important question as well, because we're both at a workshop in Yad Vashem recently, a few months ago, and we actually all spoke about, you were there too, we were speaking about Aaron Weiss and the importance of his work, because this really was a groundbreaking work, written in the, well, finished in the 70s. It was the first wave of research on the Holocaust, well, research as in academic research on the Judenrat, on the Jewish police, research such as that of Yeshua Trank as well, so, and other researchers who at that point were beginning to bridge those topics which were considered taboo during the war, immediately after the war as well. And Aaron Weiss was one of those people, and one of those pioneers of this research. This work was never published. It was only in Hebrew, but for all of us, it is still probably the most important work published today. It doesn't deal just with the Warsaw Ghetto. It deals with Jewish police as a comparative work as well in occupied Poland. So this was the first one, and the second one is Aldona Podolska, which you mentioned, from mid-1990s, the first Polish language study of the Jewish Order Service in the Warsaw Ghetto. Also a very important book. And but I felt that, maybe not felt, I knew that, you know, those were, as you said, 30 years ago, those books were published or written, and it's time to write something new. Mainly because we can now access so much more, because it's so much easier to write a book today than it was 5 years ago, because there's so much more documents which are digitalized, because we can access so many more sources. Among them, I think, a very important collection of sources, though also important for Holocaust research in general, but for this topic in particular, is a series of interviews, of oral history interviews, which were conducted in 1990s and 2000s in various documentation projects. And those thousands of interviews, even though they were conducted so long after the events and so long after the Holocaust, mainly with people who were at that point elderly, are important, because for topics like this, for topics like the Jewish Order Service, the Jewish police, so again, taboo topics, I think time must have passed, and those people at this age probably reached the point when many of them felt ready to speak about it, when many of them felt this is the right time, that many of them maybe felt that enough time has passed to be able to speak about it. So this was also an important source for my research, which wasn't available for early researchers. And aside from it, of course, open archives, Polish archives, which you could finally consult regarding the Polish police and the Polish Blue Police and the involvement of Polish Blue Police with the Jewish Order Service, and so on and so on. So I think it's just so much easier, and so much, there's so much more materials now available that I felt it should make use of.
Okay, and I think it's very interesting to hear about the process of collecting materials and what were the challenges you had to face with. Could you describe it a bit? You started to speak about it, but can you describe more about this process?
Well, I think, I'm not sure if challenge is the right word, when I think writing about the Jewish Order Service in the 1960s would have been a completely different and much more challenging process than it was in 2018. As I said, the archives are now available. This is no longer a taboo topic, and a topic that we can now research and discuss openly. And this is not just the issue, of course, of the Jewish police, it's the issue of the experience of Second World War in general. And again, not just the Holocaust, but experiences of others who were involved in the Second World War, of local collaborations, for example, in Poland, but in other countries, also similar difficult topics. Experience of women, for example, is one such topic. So all those things that were considered taboo, now with the passing generations, can be maybe more academically and more in-depth discussed. That's one thing. Also the issue of, which I just mentioned, of passing generations was important for my interviews, because I did conduct quite a few interviews with children, grandchildren of members of the Jewish Order Service. I wasn't able to speak to anyone anymore who was himself in the Jewish Order Service, but I did speak to the children who were children in the ghetto, so who witnessed their parents' involvement in the service, and grandchildren as well. And this was fascinating. And I think many of them were able to tell stories which they would find difficult to tell when their father or grandfather was still alive. They were able to maybe confront those stories. And they were also able to tell us post-war stories, which was fascinating. The stories of how a family deals with such family history.
Okay, and could you, let's say, get to the subject itself? Could you explain when and how the Jewish police was founded and what was the general structure of it?
Well, the Jewish police, the Jewish Order Service, was set up together with the ghetto. And this is in Warsaw, but it's also happening everywhere else. But I was talking about Warsaw in general because this is what I focus on. So the Jewish Order Service is set up as a really replacement of the Polish Blue Police in the ghetto. And in the German narrative, it makes sense. In a way, the ghetto is closed. This is now, quote unquote, because this is the language I'm using now is the language of German propaganda, a Jewish autonomous district. And there, the Jewish autonomous district has its authorities, the Judenrat as the Jewish council, and the Jewish police as a police force, or the keeping force. And this is, of course, part of the propaganda of how Jews are governing themselves in their own closed quarter. Completely untrue, as we know, and in reality, completely different, but that's how it's set up. So this is the Jewish Order Service. In a way, it also makes sense because this is a city. Warsaw Ghetto is a city which reaches 400,000 people, and it needs an order service. It needs a service that will keep order in the city and do all the policeman duties that police and various other bodies of that type do in our cities. So that's the beginning. That's how it's set up. The leader of the Jewish Order Service becomes Józef Szeryński, who was a very experienced policeman from before the war. He's the member of the Polish State Police. He's a convert. That's an important part of his life story. That's how he managed to go up so high in the Polish State Police before the war. He's also very successful because he becomes the first spokesman of the Polish State Police before the war. He also goes up very highly up the ranks. He's very well connected. He's undoubtedly a man who's charismatic. He definitely has friends on all levels of service. He's also working extensively in training. He's writing articles regarding police training. He's setting up new police forces in 1920s. So he's an extremely experienced and capable man, but also a man who has basically no links to the Jewish community before the war. And that is the difficult and interesting part of the story, of course, because he's the person who's chosen to form the new police force in the Warsaw Ghetto. A man who's basically from the very beginning rejected by the Jewish community, even before the Jewish Order Service, the Jewish police turns into what it finally is, and who also doesn't seem particularly interested in finding his place there, because he made a conscious decision at some point of his life to depart from it, and this is definitely a difficult place for him to be as well. So this is Szeryński, and he surrounds himself with people, mainly with lawyers, mainly with assimilated lawyers, assimilated in the Polish pre-war sense of assimilated, so a bit different than Western European sense of assimilated. So people who went to Polish schools usually, who have to a degree Polish identity, Polish cultural identity, or who consider themselves to be Polish in some cases they're converted, not many, but some of them are, but who still, of course, are never fully accepted by the Polish society as well, because of the anti-Semitism growing in the 1930s. So this is a very interesting group on its own. But anyway, he surrounds himself by people who he often knows from before the war, and because of who they are and because of their assimilation, also people who are to a large degree like him, rejected by the wider groups of ghetto inhabitants. And then they enroll policemen. They enroll 2,000 people who form the Jewish Order Service, and they are structured roughly as any police forces today. There's a leadership with Sherinsky and his officers. There are departments dealing with different aspects of its life, of the police structure. There are 6 precincts, and then there's police units affiliated with each of them. And there's quite a lot of people around it, because the membership in the Jewish Order Service, as we'll be probably talking about later or not, is a very attractive, maybe not very attractive, but it's an attractive prospect in the horror of the first months of life in the ghetto. And it does bring certain perks. It is a job which is so difficult to come across in the ghetto. So the structure is overblown to bring in as many people as possible. There are quite a few people who are employed in the offices. There are women who are not only women, but the secretaries, for example. There are young boys who are employed as messengers. There are people employed in police kitchens. There are police doctors. So when we talk about the Jewish Order Service, and much as it's often shown as this really small group of people, of assimilated men, completely insular from the ghetto, from the rest of the ghetto, it's not true. It's not just 2,000 men. It's a lot of other people who are around it. Plus, it's the support networks. It's all the people who they support. It's all the people who live thanks to them and who are able to survive. So we are talking here about quite a few thousand people who are in one way or another linked to the Jewish police, the Jewish Order Service.
And, usually we hear the critics toward the Jewish police. I would like to ask to what extent this organization contribute to the daily life in the ghetto before the deportations. How did the Jewish population see its role in real time?
This is, again, a really complex thing, because we're talking here about really almost 2 years from the setting up of the service until, let's say, deportation. So the period in which it's functioning as a Jewish Order Service, as a Jewish police. And I'm using those terms here, both terms. It is really a Jewish Order Service. And maybe we should say it to make it clear. It's set up as a Jewish Order Service, also as a way of showing its subordination to the Polish Blue Police and to the Germans as well. This is not they're not real policemen, they're just servicemen. They are meant to look after order in the ghetto. They don't really have the power of a police force. They are really order servicemen. But they are referred to in the ghetto as the Jewish police, partly because they function as a police in time. And I think there's also something quite negative about it as well. This is, of course, the image of the Polish police before the war, the very negative image of the Polish Blue Police, and then the Jewish police as a sort of continuation or something affiliated with the Polish Blue Police has a sort of negative sound to it as well. But so they function over 2 years. And their image changes very quickly. The way they viewed in November 1940 is really completely different than 2 years later, because so many things happen, and the duties change as well, and they change. They begin the work as I think just Jews, as our people, as somebody's brothers and somebody's husbands, as men who get the chance of working in the ghetto, of participating in what is an order service at that point. So participating in basically keeping order in the ghetto. At that point, nobody knows what the order service will have to do. And I'm not even speaking about deportations, because it's completely out of question, of course, but even things like roundups for forced labor, or things like fighting the typhus epidemic, quote unquote, because of course, as we know, that the methods of fighting the typhus epidemic in the ghetto were just another way of persecuting the ghetto. They were completely counterproductive and had no impact on fighting the epidemic itself, but quite a lot of impact on raising the mortality in the ghetto and making people even more impoverished. So there's the duties which are getting worse and worse. And as we know, there's basically no Germans in the ghetto. So they really become the face of the German oppression, because they are the ones who do the roundups for forced labor camps. And again, forced labor camps are really a part of, I mean, the name is part of Nazi propaganda to an extent, because forced labor camps are basically almost death camps. People who go there are coming back to the ghetto, if they are coming back, in extremely bad physical and emotional mental condition. And of course, many of them die there as well. So those duties change. They're considered more and more negatively because of that. They're seen more and more as the German, the sort of equivalent of the Germans. Even in some writings that we read from before the deportations, they are described as worse than the Germans because people are scared of them. They are the ones who can really hurt you. They're the ones who can really negatively influence your life. And why that's happening is another thing, and how they see it is another thing. But let's see this is how they're perceived. That's one thing. And of course, the other thing is that they change themselves because they have to cope with it. They have to cope emotionally with it. They have to explain themselves why they're doing it. And the wall between the Jewish policemen, the Jewish police force, and the rest of the ghetto is growing. And it's, I know the wall is the right word here, but the gap is growing, let's say it. And it's, you know, it's being deepened from both sides. It's not just one side. It's not one part of the both groups are quite negatively and increasingly negatively disposed towards each other.
How much influence, if any, had the Judenrat or the high rank officers on the policeman actions as a group, as an institution, or personally?
And that's another great question, and really a question of the propaganda which I was talking about, of this narrative of like Jews, you know, governing themselves, and this Jewish police fulfilling the orders of the Judenrat. And this is everything that appears in German propaganda already during the war, because if we look at German propaganda newspapers which are published outside the ghetto in Poland, they show Jewish policemen beating people on the streets. And they show ghetto as this, you know, completely unlawful place, which is ridden with typhus and dangerous, and the Jewish policemen are there as part of this. So, and the German propaganda film that's being shot in the ghetto in 1942 also shows Jewish policemen beating children up, beating little smugglers. So they appear as in German propaganda in a sense as well. But in Warsaw case, and this is again just Warsaw, because other ghettos have different, the relationship between the Judenrat and the Jewish police is different everywhere. And I think it very strongly influences how the policemen act and how they perceive as well. But in Warsaw ghetto, there isn't very, well, the Jewish police is subordinate partly to the Judenrat as well, undoubtedly. And the Judenrat does, you know, use it to fulfill its duties, which it has to carry out vis-a-vis the German administration. But I think personally, I don't think it does have it's not very strong. It's not extremely strong. And this is mainly due to Szariński, who I already mentioned, who's a very powerful and very strong man in his own right, and who's carrying out his own, he's sort of ruling the Jewish police on his own in a way. I mean, with the Polish police as well, as he's more interested in subordinating the Jewish police to the Polish police, I would say, Polish blue police, than to the Judenrat. I think his links to the Polish blue police are very strong, and the influence of Polish blue police on his actions is very clear. There's also, of course, an issue of his personal relationship with Adam Czerniaków, who's the head of the chairman of Warsaw Judenrat, Jewish Council, which are also quite positive, and that's another way. I think they just sort of both agree that the Jewish police is doing its own thing and trying to govern itself. And Szariński is undoubtedly trying to stop the demoralization of the service in one way or another. Not always successful, as we know. He's surrounded by a group of people who are all fighting for influences, like in any organization of this type, especially when we speak of so much that can be gained and so much poverty and horror around them. Those people are fighting for influences. There are many internal different groups within the Jewish Order Service. And of course, there's also, individual policemen and those relations between the officers and the Jewish policemen, people on the lowest ranks, who, despite what's being said about them, are often very poor and are often barely surviving with their families, who are also dying of typhus like the rest of the ghetto, are another thing. It is a very complex organization in that sense.
In the summary of your book, you mentioned that there was, as you say, now also the big diversity in the police, and therefore it's difficult to characterize one type of policeman. And yeah, do you think we can find any common biographical background or any other something that can explain behavior of some of the policemen?
So now if we can explain, there's definitely things that they share. And those things come from the fact that it wasn't easy to get into the Jewish police. When the first intakes, people who were getting in were people who had friends in the right places, who had parents in the right places, who had enough money to pay a large bribe to get in. So people who are well positioned in the society. The vast majority of, as I already said, were coming from at least a cultured background and had friends in the circle around Sherinsky. So this is what they shared. We have, for example, testimonies of people coming from prestigious Polish high schools who would say that they had quite a few friends from school in the Jewish order service. There were also quite a few people from Łódź. That was another key through which they were getting in the service. So basically you had to get through one of the paths. There was no other way. You couldn't just come from the street and be accepted. In time, it got even more difficult because there was rotation in the service. People were leaving if they could. If they could get a job somewhere else, they often decided to leave for one reason or another, mainly because of how badly the Jewish order service was perceived in time and how difficult that work was as well, and how taxing. That was one thing. But again, getting into the service later on was even more difficult and required even better contacts and required even more money. They were definitely perceived as a monolith by the ghetto population. And increasingly so as their actions changed and as their actions were seen as threatening. So they were perceived as quote unquote assimilated, as already said. There were people who claimed that they were all converts, which of course wasn't true. They were perceived as people who don't speak Yiddish, for example, who only speak Polish, and that was a big issue. In the ghetto itself, with increasing number of refugees and deportees coming, there were also ghetto people who only spoke Yiddish. A policeman who would only speak Polish was the other. They were increasingly seen as the other. I think that's the easiest way of saying it. They were increasingly seen as people who were outside the ghetto community. And this was because of how they acted, so because they were seen as threatening, but it was also a way of dealing with it. And I'm still speaking about the period before deportations, to make it clear. This is before the Umschlagplatz, before the deportation of Treblinka. But increasingly so in late 1941 and late 1942, they're described as non-Jews. They are described as people who are not Jewish and shouldn't be considered to be part of the community. People who, through their actions, put themselves outside the community.
Can we find differences between the high-rank officers to the regular policemen? Wittelson, or so-called Wittelson, one of the policemen, really wrote as it's like two different, I would say, kind of people, the high-rank officers and the regular policemen. So what do you think about it?
Well, undoubtedly, the difference is money, basically. If you were an officer, you had a salary, and you also had a larger share of bribes that were taken by the Jewish policemen. You had easier access to money. Your life was easier in many ways. You had friends higher up in the Judenrat. Your life was easier. If you were a low-level policeman, you were getting up every day and patrolling the streets. You were organizing the movement on ghetto streets. You were in danger very often because of typhus being one thing. If you were working on ghetto walls, you of course could take your share of smuggling sometimes. but it didn't really apply to everyone. But you were in direct danger from violence from the Germans, because that's where Jews and Germans really met on the ghetto wall. If you were a regular policeman, this really was a dangerous and very difficult job. And we have many testimonies of which claim that the regular members of the Jewish Order Service were often very impoverished, that their families were starving sometimes, were as poor as any other families of, let's say, Jewish intelligentsia in the ghetto could be. That they, and of course, this also was linked to conflicts within the service, because those poor policemen, poor as in not wealthy policemen on the lower levels, were seeing how the officers are getting wealthier. They were seeing how they're drinking in bars, how they're taking very large bribes from people who did businesses in the ghettos, because of course where the money was, not bribes from regular people on the street, but bribes from businesses which are being held in the ghetto, that they may be increasingly becoming involved with Gestapo collaborators, with the 13 as well, which was basically openly Gestapo collaborator unit, and they're getting wealthier, while at the same time the regular policemen are suffering and are working extremely hard, carrying out dangerous work for nothing.
Let me ask about the deportation. In many testimonies, we can find very hard and difficult words about the police actions during the deportations. But how significant was the Jewish police, the Jewish Order Service role in those events actually?
Wow, that's really probably the most difficult part of it, isn't it? It's difficult also when it comes to sources, because when we speak about what happens before, we have those sources which are in the underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, so interviews with the Jewish policemen carried out before the deportations, their testimonies, there are also documents from the Jewish police coming from before deportations. So we have quite a nice collection of sources which draw a very complex story, which I was trying to tell you, of a service which acts differently, of people who are differently perceived, of the growing hostility, but nonetheless a complex and different story. Now, when it comes to what happens during deportations, we of course only have one story. We don't have any stories coming from the Jewish policemen concerning deportation. Unlike Otwock, where we have a very famous testimony book by Czarek Perechodnik, in which he describes his actions on during deportations. And for those of you who don't know it, and I strongly recommend it, he's actually a Jewish policeman from Otwock who's physically putting his wife and child on the transport to Treblinka, and then writes about it and tries to deal with it in his memoir. But we don't have voices like it from Warsaw. We have voices written, we have testimonies written afterwards, of course before, other than one poem of Władysław Szlengel, in which he describes the decision to take off his hat and leave the Jewish Order Service. We don't have anything else. So the only story that we have is that coming from the victims. And I mean here, direct victims and people who are actually taken to the Umschlagplatz by the Jewish policemen and somehow managed to survive, but also victims in a sense that people whose family was taken by the Jewish Order Service, and basically everybody was, or whose dearest, who maybe might have been even outside the ghetto at that point, but who knew the Jewish Order Service somehow participated in the deportation of the families. So this already adds to the emotional aspect of it. But undoubtedly they did participate. Then the question of how deportations could have been carried out without their involvement, they would have been carried out, we know that. We can assume if we differently probably, I mean, we can only, guess here at what would have looked like. I'm certain that they would have been carried out just a bit differently, but maybe more visibly, but they would have happened. So they did participate, and they acted differently. And that's another, I think, really, I don't know if the word interesting is the right word here, but they did act very differently. We should remember that, because this is often forgotten, that again, when we have this picture of this monolith of this horrors of deportation, Jewish order service in the middle of it, putting people on trains to Treblinka, we should remember that there were people who acted very differently. There were people who decided to leave the service during the deportations. There were people, and that's, I think, a very large number of them, who stayed in the Jewish order service for as long as it took them to safeguard their families. So once the family was safe, one that was taken out of the ghetto, they left the service there or escaped themselves. But also there were those who acted in a completely different way, who used it as a way of making money, who used it as a way of abuse, or who acted extremely cruelly. And we know those stories too. So there were very, very different patterns of behavior at those days. And basically each of them depended on who it was and what the life situation was as well.
If we'll try to, I would say, to listen to the policemen themselves. So how did they explain their actions to themselves and to others before the deportation, after, and maybe if you can see differences between their explanation before and after the deportations?
This is actually a very good question. As I say, there are two really types of sources that we can use for this. The ones from before deportations are testimonies of Jewish policemen, which are in the underground archive. So Emanuel Ringelblum, the founder of the underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, had among people he cooperated with actually at least 2 Jewish policemen, if not more. And they collected for him voices of the Jewish policemen, which were to serve as a part of a large survey and large essay on the Jewish police in the Warsaw Ghetto. And their methods of explaining themselves are, as we can imagine today. So they basically say, that they need to support their families. There's no other way of making money in the ghetto. They need a job, and that's the job they have. That they're trying to carry it out in as non-violent way as possible. They underline what you just said about the difference between the officers and the other policemen, the difference between the good policemen, quote unquote, and bad policemen who deal with the smugglers and the other ones. They make distinction within the Jewish order service. So they, for example, draw a picture of a group of intellectuals in the Jewish order service who are fighting for its to improve its actions and see themselves as part of it. They also underline, and that's in the internal writings more than those which are aimed at others. They underline the vision of the Jewish order service as a way of safeguarding the ghetto from the Jewish cruelty and the German cruelty or German violence. So they basically say that if we don't carry it out, if we don't do roundups for forced labor, then the Germans will come in the ghetto and they'll do it themselves. And that will be much worse for the community. That will be done in a much more cruel way, and nobody wants that. And this is also how they explain to themselves. So if you look at the writings, which were things which were written for the Jewish order service by the Jews, so the internal writings of the service, this is very often portrayed that way. That the ghetto community unfortunately does not understand it as they write, but our role is to really keep the ghetto safe from German interference. Of course, Warsaw is not the only case. We know of other ghettos where this narrative is it's being employed. After the deportations, it changes a little bit because what we have from the writings which we have from after deportations are really large defense statements, I have to think of what I should say. These are memoirs, and quite a few of them, as you know, which are now partly in Yad Vashem, partly in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, but also in other places, which were written by policemen who were already in hiding, a large number of them, or immediately after the war, but a large part of them in hiding. And in hiding, they were trying to reconstruct the defense line for after the war in a way, or they were trying to show don't know if you can say it in as positive light as possible, but they were definitely trying to construct some sort of defense line. And I think they often show the Jewish order service as part of German policy, in a way that the Jewish order service from the very beginning, even though they had no idea about it, prepared for deportations and prepared for involvement in the deportations, but they just did not know about it. So this is sort of also part of the German conquer and divide and conquer rule of dividing the ghetto community and then using part of it, which doesn't know about it in mass murder as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll finish my questions right now because there are quite a few questions already from our audience. So everyone who would like to can submit his or her questions. And I'll start. Simcha Stein asked, please, your response to the politicians' statements today about seeing the Jewish policemen as collaborators.
That's a great question, one which was really important in my work. Jewish police was used in this anti-Semitic as well narrative, because I think I can refer here to what's happening in where the Jewish police is used in the part of the anti-Semitic narrative of collaboration. In the anti-Semitic narrative of collaboration immediately, even during the Second World War, in order to show that Jews were really killing themselves, so just really bringing themselves to death. This was also part of, for example, in Poland in 1968, part of the comparison in Poles who did not collaborate and Jews who collaborated. So it's been used in anti-Semitic narrative and it's used to this day. That's one side of it. But of course, the other side, it was also used in the internal Jewish communal narrative in order, I think, maybe to simplify that that image doing this divide between the underground fighters who are the good ones and the Jewish members of the Judenrat, Jewish order service, who are the bad ones, and seeing the community as those who come from or follow the lessons of the underground fighters. It's also the Jewish honor courts functioning around the world after the war, where trials in Israel as well were working in the name. And it was only really, as we said at the beginning, in late 60s, early 1970s, with works like that are advised that this myth was being slowly dispersed. But it's unfortunately, in terms of anti-Semitic narrative, it's still a very important part of it, and it still functions.
Mm-hmm. Now, with your permission, I'll combine two questions. One is, can you expand on Yaakov Leikin personality? And the other, if you can tell us a bit about some policeman that you, I don't know, he has a special story or a story that interesting in your opinion, then can you tell us about it?
Yaakov Leikin was a very interesting person in a way that he really, I think his life, I don't know if you agree with me, because of course you know his life story very well too, and I know, but I think that his life story really well shows the dynamics happening in the Warsaw Jewish order service, because he sort of comes in slightly from the outside. He's starting at the very bottom, well, not very bottom, but he's not high level to begin with. He's not very well connected, and then he goes up, reaching the position of the acting head of the Jewish order service after Szeriński's arrest. So he goes to the very top. He actually raises for the rank very quickly, and he does it by being extremely involved and by also showing cruelty, by fulfilling the German requests very well, by organizing roundup for forced labor. He plays an important part in that. People are fascinated by him by all means. He's also very short, which probably you know that. he was actually too short to be a Jewish policeman, and that was very often brought up. And then, well, he also became a victim of an assassination. So his life, I think, shows in a fascinating way the dynamics and the changes happening within the Jewish Order Service. But people were fascinated by him. I think you agree that he appears also, why he's so important, because he appears so much in writings writings by others. People write a lot about him and are really interested in his rise, in the way he rises for the ranks. So he's probably one of the most interesting people in the Jewish Order Service. But of course, there are many, many others, better and worse known, who Stanisław Adler. I would say those who leave those testimonies. Stanisław Adler is an interesting person. Was also a high-level policeman who quits before deportation, and he leaves a very interesting. He committed suicide just after the war, but left a fascinating testimony to life in the ghetto. His book, which is also available in English. But there's just so many others and so many really fascinating stories.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Anonymous. Ask you, I understand that all these Jewish policemen were deported with the other Jews to the camps later. Do we know something about their lives in the camps, especially the relationship with other Jews from the ghetto? I think Bervam specifically wrote about it, but I'm sure you can share with us also other.
Absolutely, and also spoke to people who were in transports and who told me about how the Jewish police were treated in the transports. They weren't all taking transports. Some of them, yes. There were numerous selections within the order service as the deportations progressed. The leadership of the service was actually killed in the Warsaw, was shot and executed just before the Warsaw uprising. Some of them managed to survive. Some of them escaped and survived in hiding. Some of them were basically shared the fate of people in hiding. So some of them were murdered. Some died in the Warsaw uprising, 1944 Warsaw uprising. So they had different fates, but yes, a large number of them, majority of them were killed. And we have testimonies regarding the fate in the camps, and we know that there were definitely members of the Jewish Order Service from Warsaw who were killed already in transport by others who were being transported. And we also know a lot about the fate after the war, about those who did survive and who did have to undergo quite a long process of clearing their names in front of various courts. If they decide to stay in Poland, Polish courts, then various professional courts, the Jewish Honor Court by the Central Committee of Jews in Poland as well, tried a number of policemen from the Warsaw Ghetto. If they decided to leave, they were tried by courts in DP camps. And there was also quite a lot. There was definitely not quite a lot. There was very clear stigma, of course, attached to being a policeman. Some of them changed their names, and we have cases like that as well, of people who decided to change their names after the war, after immigration, in order to not be linked to the past in the Jewish police. So the post-war story is really extremely interesting and something that I'm really, really fascinated by.
Okay. Tal Scheinbach, first the apologies that maybe it's not a very easy question, but I'll ask it anyway. How does publication of on Jewish police impact public opinion in Poland in terms of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial? And I'll add that it's quite interesting that in the last few years, there were published a few memoirs. Gombiński's, Adler's was published in Polish again. So interesting question.
It's a very interesting question. And it was also part of why I wrote the book, is because, as I said, the Jewish Order Service to this day forms an extremely important and extremely key part, really, of the anti-Semitic narrative regarding the Holocaust in Poland. And there are publications clearly of clean anti-Semitic character, which write and discuss the Jewish Order Service in that sense, as a collaboration unit, as those who actually, brought Jews to the Holocaust, to Treblinka, and so on, so on. So, and very often in comparing them with those who did not collaborate. So it was already that was a state of public knowledge, so to speak, when I started writing about it. And my aim really was to make it as complex as possible and to show how complex choices those people faced and how difficult choices they faced, and how complex and difficult this story was. Whether I succeeded, I don't know, and whether those people who believe in Holocaust denial will ever read my book, published by the Jewish Historical Institute, I strongly doubt they will. And I mean, like every academic, I would love for my research to change the world and public perception, but I don't think it will. I think those who read it already have a clear view of it, in a way. But well, maybe, who knows? Maybe someone will read it and change his mind completely and her mind. That would be great.
We can try to be optimistic about it. Ron Valedinger asks, where will you put the Jewish police between victims and collaborators or perpetrators?
Well, they are victims. There's no, there's no way of questioning it. They are victims. They are a group of victims because victims are a complex group and victims behaved differently too. Just as the other groups. And there are victims who were, I think we can say, often considered by other victims perpetrators. But from today, somehow we see it today. I think we have to just classify these victims as who they were.
Okay, someone ask us to repeat the name of your book. And does it appear in English? So yes, it will appear in English soon. Can you tell us exactly when?
In April 2021.
And to repeat the name of the book, we can...
Warsaw Police. It will be called in English and it will be published by Cornell University Press.
Okay. And did Sherinsky and the other converted police officer live inside the ghetto? What did become of him?
That's a very interesting question again, and sort of part of how they did live in the ghetto. Yes, absolutely. They were, in the eyes of the Germans, they were Jews. There was the fact that they were converted had no influence on their legal standing. They were still Jews according to Nazi law in Poland, and they were in the ghetto. They lived in of course the best street, if you can speak of the best streets of the ghetto, that's where they lived. There were also two Catholic churches functioning in the ghetto. One of them had a large parish, and in that parish lived a number of converted Jews, and among them were some Jewish policemen as well. Yes, they absolutely lived in the ghetto, and Sherinsky committed, I shouldn't say, but I should have said before. Sherinsky was, he became the victim of one of the first armed actions of the Jewish underground. It was his attempt assassination, which didn't succeed. He was wounded, but he wasn't killed. And he committed suicide in early 1943.
Ziva Bar Yosef asked, can you ask, this is for me, can I ask about the corruption in the Jewish police?
Okay, that's again part of what's happening in the Jewish police for its functioning. As I said, the Jewish policemen did not have regular wages. Then they were gradually being introduced in different ways, but in order to stop the corruption, so that's why they were introduced. But to begin with, they didn't have wages. Only officers had wages. And the only way of supporting themselves really was corruption. And we again can speak here of various levels of corruption. There are people who were the so-called players, so they were standing on the ghetto gates and taking large amounts of money from the smugglers, from like large-scale smugglers. There were people who were involved very heavily in the ghetto underworld, so who were, for example, taking almost, you could say, mafia-like bribes from ghetto, not the businessmen, but entrepreneurs, let's say people who had factories in the ghetto, were paying them off. So these are really large amounts of money that could have been made. But there are also bribes on the smaller level, on the lower level. So small bribes from someone who wanted to leave the house that was quarantined because of typhus, from someone who wanted to skip the queue to get into the office of the Judenrat, from a small smuggler, from a child who wanted to, bring the bread through a hole in the wall and had to pay off the policeman who caught him, and so on and so on. So they in terms of corruption, we can speak really of all levels, from a few brushes to substantial amounts of money. And they depended again on the position of where those people were in the ghetto, in the hierarchy of the Jewish order service. But they were definitely seen as corrupted by the rest of of ghetto inhabitants, and that did influence the way they were seen and their image very, very strongly.
If I may add, I think the definition of corruption is also quite complex in this context, because for some of the policemen, this smuggling, for example, was actually a way to help to the ghetto, in their opinion. If we read what Gombinsky wrote, or what also Bervam wrote, as smuggling is part of the ghetto life now. It's a way of living in some ways.
Absolutely, and they were also portraying sometimes like that. They were saying, for example, well, if the Germans were doing the roundup of the quarantine buildings, then you wouldn't be able to pay a German off. You have to stay in and most likely, probably catch typhus. But since the Jewish policeman, you can give him a bit of money, and you can give him a bit of money, and so they were sort of showing this that also humane way of growing corruption, endemic corruption in the ghetto in general.
Okay, we're getting close to the end of our meeting, but there are 3 more questions. One of them, I think, I don't know if you can answer it shortly, but someone asked about Ganzweich and 13. If you can put them in.
Difficult. That is very difficult, actually, and that's still a topic that requires study, and that hasn't really been anything that much published on this topic. So I think it's something that still awaits its historian. But the 13, yes, of course, was basically an open Gestapo collaboration unit in the Warsaw ghetto, which is interesting in context of the Jewish police as well, because as we know, the Jewish policemen in Warsaw ghetto did not actually have many contacts with the Germans, and unlike in other ghettos, I don't think that collaboration aspect of it, in terms of relationship with the Gestapo, for example, was very strong in the Jewish order service. For example, Szeryński did not really have any personal, we should underline that really, personal, contacts with not very many with German administration. And the Warsaw Jewish police was not really involved in that type of collaboration when you speak about contacts with Gestapo German administration, because the 13 was the unit that was really involved in it and sort of took over that aspect of ghetto life. But it's a fascinating topic that I think still really requires a lot of work and a lot of archival work as well.
So you have the next topic for your next research now? Okay. Did any who survived got to live in Israel?
Yeah.
I think from Warsaw, yeah?
Oh, wait. I say yes, quite happily. I don't know. Do you know where from Warsaw? Not from Warsaw. I mean, from other ghettos, of course, we know.
I think also not from Warsaw, but from other ghettos.
A lot of those who were actually from Warsaw stayed in Poland. They were lawyers before the war. They had higher education, among those who survived, and they decided to stay in Poland. So the Jewish honor court in Warsaw actually tried a lot of Jewish policemen from Warsaw, and the DP camps, for example, not so many, because not so many of them that I know of chose to emigrate. Some did, but I think a large number of them actually decided and stayed in Poland.
Okay, so I must apologize for the people we didn't ask the questions, but we need to finish in the time we promised. So first of all, I really would like to thank you very much for let us having you here. Thanks a lot. And thank you all for taking part of the first event of our series. I would like to thank also to Moreshet, Mordechai Anielevich Memorial Education and Research Center, to the Emanuel Ringelblum Jewish Historical Institute, and to the Polish Institute in Tel Aviv. Our next event will take place on the 21st of December, when we'll host Mr. Matan Shefi, one of the Jewish Historical Institute genealogic specialists. Keep safe. Thank you again, and have a good evening. Thank you.